This is a production of Cornell University.
It's an enormous pleasure to have the chance to introduce Derek Attridge, as well as to formally welcome him to Cornell. Is this on at all? I have such a loud voice. You probably don't. Derek's experienced one of those academic careers that verges on being legendary in terms of its range and scope, its importance, and its influence. As some of you may be aware, he began his career as a scholar of Renaissance literature, writing a dissertation that turned into his first book on Elizabethan verse. He's since written 11 books and co-edited 10 different volumes, which is to say his many publications become almost difficult to count. And he has a total of 3 different books, all forthcoming right now, each due to be published within the next couple of months. We're soon to see The Craft of Poetry, Dialogues on Minimal Interpretation, coming out with Routledge, Derek Attridge in Conversation, and The Work of Literature, which will be published with Oxford. In the midst of his highly prolific career, the range of Derek's expertise is also stunning. I first came to know of his reputation as a James Joyce scholar, and then later as one of the leading experts on J.M. Coetzee, who we'll hear him talk about today. Throughout his career, he's also written widely and extensively on poetry, in books such as Poetic Rhythm, an Introduction, and Meter and Meaning, an Introduction to Rhythm in Poetry. And he's also a major and visible theorist, and is especially known for his work on post-structuralist thought, linguistics, and deconstruction. For instance, you might have encountered his work through Jacques Derrida's Acts of Literature, which he edited, or his highly influential collection, Theory After Theory, co-edited with Jane Elliott, which takes stock of how recent political developments have fueled new directions in critical theory, whether biopolitics, speculative materialism, or post-colonial studies. I discovered as I was preparing this that I had put not 2, but 3 books in my Amazon.com shopping cart, so any further enticement to spend greater time with his work. And just to underscore the breadth and wonderful eclecticism of Professor Attridge's scholarship, I was hearing last night about another current book project that he's presently working on while a fellow at the National Humanities Center this semester, which is a study of poetry and performance from Homer to the Renaissance. Just as it's hard to relate the breadth and scope of Derek's career without becoming a bit dizzy, it's difficult to capture the importance of his writing in a brief introduction like this. I won't attempt to speak of his impact on the study of early modern literature or his seminal work on poetry and verse, otherwise we won't get to hear him talk, but to offer merely a few other snapshots of his work. His peculiar language, Literature as Difference from the Renaissance to Joyce, was published in 1988, reissued in 2004, and still remains in print. In Peculiar Language, widely regarded as one of the most important studies of the language of literature, Derek draws upon deconstruction to examine the self-contradictions produced by attempts to define literary language. These are investigations that he continued in a number of groundbreaking studies of James Joyce. For instance, the co-edited collection on semi-colonial Joyce revolutionized Joyce scholarship by bringing the insights of post-colonial theory to bear on Joyce's oeuvre, showing how questions of empire and race inform his classic ambivalence about the category of the nation. Professor Attridge has also been at the forefront of work on South African literature. As that country has transitioned beyond apartheid, we'll have to keep our eyes out for another new project that he's pursuing on the importance of Afrikaans writing, and he's recently been a co-editor of 2 different collections on South African writing, most recently the 2012 Cambridge History of South African Literature with David Atwell. But since we're going to hear him talk about J.M. Coetzee today, I'll close with a few words about that body of scholarship. Professor Attridge's writings on Coetzee have electrified Coetzee criticism in ways rivaled by few, if any other, Coetzee critics. I myself distinctly recall encountering his 2004 The Singularity of Literature and J.M. Coetzee and the Ethics of Reading, Literature and the Event as a graduate student. As for many students of Coetzee, my engagement with those 2 texts was the catalyst for more than just ideas, but a full dissertation chapter and then eventually a book. Derek's approach to reading and understanding Coetzee's highly elusive fiction has given shape to a distinct interpretive framework that one cannot but respond to and interface with if one sets out to write about Coetzee, who, for many scholars of contemporary fiction, is the, if not one of the most important living authors. So to talk about Coetzee, it virtually requires that one address Derek's approach to him, which is grounded in a compelling account of the singular capacities of literary creativity. As Derek argues, the essence of literary creation is to give voice to alterity in ways that disrupt normative conceptions of the world and are therefore inherently related to matters of social justice. Derek offers a powerful statement of the political and social value of literature, which he explicitly locates within its non-instrumentality, resistance to the discourses of philosophy, politics, and law, and fundamentally other-oriented ethical status. Derek's work on Coetzee thus offers a powerful statement of the value of literature and the humanities in the face of the growing quantification of scholarly and creative output within the neoliberal university. Just a few reasons why we're so lucky to have him with us today. I don't want to take further time away from his talk. Please turn off your cell phones if you haven't, and I've also been urged to ask people to move toward the front of the room. Finally, a reminder that there will also be a reception upstairs, which we'll remind you about again after the talk in the English Department Lounge.
Thanks very much, Liz. I think I must get you to review my forthcoming books. If you don't mind coming a bit further down, but it's okay, you're not that far back, those of you who are at the back. Maybe just in the question time we'll want to be as intimate as we can be in a room this size. I've called this talk Character and Counterfocalization, Coetzee's Kafkan Modernism, although I think now I look at it, it ought to have a question mark at the end. Coetzee's Kafkan Modernism, question mark? Or Coetzee's Kafkan Modernism, question mark? Something like that. And it's in 3 parts. The first part is called Why is Lucy Silent? Disgrace and Counterfocalization. The question of character hasn't had a great deal of attention in recent decades, other than in more strictly narratological studies. All the more reason then to welcome John Froe's recent book, Character and Person, which ranges richly over a number of topics and literary examples to offer a nuanced account of the operation of character in fiction, making clear the dialectical relation between our construction of characters as we read and our construction of each other as persons in our daily lives. One thread that runs through Froe's discussion, and one that I'll be picking up in my own discussion, is the relation between, quote, thinking of characters as pieces of writing or imaging and thinking of them as person-like entities, end of quote. This is another quote from Froe. These two ways of thinking about character are logically difficult to hold together, and yet we do so in our every encounter with fictional character. Our pleasure in reading a novel, then, lies simultaneously in a willing suspension of disbelief, whereby we respond to characters as if they had lives beyond the words in which they are conveyed to us, and in an appreciation of the writer's handling of language and generic conventions in such a way as to create this illusion. The question of character is at the heart of a recent disagreement between 2 acute readers of J.M. Coetzee's novel Disgrace, Gayatri Spivak and Simon During, the former in her mammoth volume An Aesthetic Education in the Time of Globalization, in an essay that was originally published in Diacritics a few years earlier, and the latter in a PMLA forum on Spivak's volume. The disagreement arises in connection with a facet of the novel that has garnered a great deal of commentary: Lucy Leary's refusal to lay charges against the 3 men who have raped her, or even to fully explain this refusal to her father. A silence which has the consequence that as readers we too are kept in ignorance of her motivation, since Coetzee's fictional mode allows us no information beyond what David Leary knows. Spivak embraces the narratological concept of focalization to discuss this feature of the novel, taking the term from Mika Ball, who herself adopts it from Gérard Genette. There are significant differences between Genette's and Ball's uses of the term, and the former introduced it as a more precise concept than perspective or point of view, which we might more often use, but for our purposes, whereas Ball is a lot less clearly distinguished from the idea of perspective or point of view. But for our purposes, it's sufficient to treat it as roughly equivalent to these more traditional terms. Focalization, however we define it, I'm sure we'd all agree, is a fundamental property of narrative that experienced readers process without difficulty. And the case of disgrace is not a complicated one. We have an external narrator, what is more traditionally known as a third-person narrator, who has no function other than to deliver the narrative. And we have character-bound focalization, which presents the story exclusively from one character's, David Leary's, point of view. That the narrator tells the story in the present tense has important consequences for the reading experience, but it's not a dimension of the novel that is relevant to this discussion. Spivak's argument is that, since, I quote, disgrace is relentless in keeping the focalization confined to David Leary, and Lucy is resolutely denied focalization, the reader is provoked into imagining, this is my summary now of Spivak, the reader is provoked into imagining the scenes in which Lucy is a participant from her point of view, a mode of interpretation that Spivak terms counterfocalization. I'll come to Düring's contrasting view in due course, but first I'd like to explore what Spivak means by counterfocalization, a concept with a number of implications for our understanding of the reading of fiction and of Coetzee's fiction in particular. As far as I know, the term hasn't caught on in the world of narratology, and perhaps it never will, but it raises in sharp form a concern that any account of the reading of literature needs to confront. Is the reader passive or active? Is reading a literary work a matter of carrying out the instructions already implicit in the words and in the relevant generic norms, or is it a matter of exercising ingenuity and interpretive skill in generating meaning from the sentences? It doesn't take much thought to see that this is not in fact an either-or question, and elsewhere I've used the compound term activent to refer to this paradoxical dual nature of literary reading as something we do, but at the same time as something that happens to us. But it's surely possible to weight one's reading and one's account of reading in one or other direction. So, should counterfocalization be understood as tending towards the passive side or the active side? Spivak introduces her discussion of counterfocalization in Disgrace with a question that manages to sit on both sides of the fence. Quote, what rhetorical signal does Disgrace give to the canny reader? The text, it seems, actively gives signals that we automatically then presumably read, but at the same time, the reader must be canny to pick them up. And this ambiguity persists as she goes on. This is Spivak again. When Lucy is resolutely denied focalization, the reader is provoked, for he or she does not want to share in Lurie, the chief vocalizer's inability to read Lucy as patient and agent. No reader is content with acting out the failure of reading. This is the rhetorical signal to the active reader to counterfocalize. On the one hand, the reader, by implication, I guess the good reader, is provoked by the text, and no reader will do otherwise. And we hear again about the rhetorical signal that the text gives us. But on the other hand, this reader is said to be active. And in what follows, it's the latter version that she emphasizes. Spivak again. This shuttle between focalization and the making of an alternative narrative as the reader's running commentary, as it were, used to be designated by the prim phrase dramatic irony when I was an undergraduate. You will see immediately how much more effortful and active this counterfocalization is than what that term can indicate. End of quote. By counterfocalizing through Lucy, Spivak asserts, we're able to read the novel correctly as a critique of her father. Quoting again, it is precisely this limited perfect validity of the liberal white ex-colonizer's understanding that disgrace questions through the invitation to focalize the enigma of Lucy. If we, like Lurie, ignore the enigma of Lucy, the novel, being fully focalized precisely by Lurie, can be made to say every racist thing. End of quote. So, if we miss the novel's signals, we will wrongly take it to be a failure, and an ethically and politically pernicious one at that. Such an act of counterfocalization implies that the reader is invited to treat a character entirely in the first of the two ways outlined by Froh, thinking of her as a person-like entity, that is, with her own independent existence outside the text written by Coetzee, rather than treating the created persona as a piece of writing. When Spivak goes on to give an example of counterfocalization, however, the tension between these two approaches reasserts itself. Her explanation of Lucy's response to her father when he asks her if she imagines living like a dog, and her reply is, yes, like a dog, consists of an appeal to the intertextual connections this statement calls up with King Lear and Kafka's The Trial. Yet few readers would picture Lucy at this fraught moment thinking about the literary analogues to her expression. When Lucy says like a dog, she doesn't have Shakespeare or Kafka in mind. So the intertextuality is Coetzee's, or more accurately, the implied author's, and it does indeed serve to complicate Leary's position, like many of the comments of the other characters in the novel, but it can't be said to do so via the process of counterfocalization. However, something like counterfocalization no doubt happens in our reading of most narratives that, like Disgrace, proceed from a single point of view, and it would be possible to construct a rough spectrum along which we could range these works. At one extreme would be examples where irony is clearly at work in the presentation of the story. So, for example, in Emma, Jane Austen limits the point of view to the heroine, yet gives us sufficient clues to understand better than Emma herself does what is passing through Mr. Elton's or Harriet Smith's minds. At the other extreme would be, say, Beckett's trilogy, where there's very little encouragement to speculate on the inner lives of the characters encountered by the protagonists. Somewhere in the middle, perhaps, we might place James's novels, in which we're constantly invited to ponder, usually without reaching any firm conclusion, the thoughts and motivations of those with whom the focalizing consciousness interacts. And we might also range readers along the scale from the most passive to the most active, depending on the amount of effort they're prepared to put in to the imaginative contribution, the imaginative construction involved in counterfocalization. Coetzee himself gives a fictional example of a highly creative process of counterfocalization in Elizabeth Costello's fictional fiction, The House on Eccles Street, featuring Joyce's Molly Bloom, who's given only one chapter in Ulysses, although a long and very detailed exposure of her own mental world. And we might include also Coetzee's invention of a female castaway in Foe as another instance of extreme counterfocalization, where the alternative focalizer is somebody who doesn't even appear in the original novel. If we posit a reader somewhere in the middle of this second spectrum, one who looks for that which is excluded by the focalizing consciousness, but is reluctant to go beyond what the text itself justifies, the question arises, what would such a reader say about Disgrace, or how would such a reader respond to Disgrace, to these scenes in Disgrace involving Lucy and her father? Certainly, that its focalizer has an outlook damagingly limited by his cultural formation and personality, and that this limitation provides encouragement to the reader to attempt to see and understand beyond what he sees and understands. And this definitely is, I think, a type of irony, one that's present from the very first sentence of the novel, which I'm sure you all know. For a man of his age, 52, divorced, he has, to his mind, solved the problem of sex rather well, where the tone of self-satisfaction immediately invites the reader to consider Leary from the outside at the same time as entering into his mental world. And we encounter a series of characters whom we know only through Leary's responses to them. Soraya, Melanie, Rosalind, Mr. Isaacs, Lucy herself, Petrus, Bevshaw, and others. And in each case, it seems to me, the inadequacy of those responses, of Leary's responses, provokes us into at least the beginning of a process of counterfocalization. This impulse to counterfocalize, as Speeder points out, is particularly strong in the case of Lucy because of Lurie's failed attempt at reading her. As readers, we want to do a better job ourselves. But this impulse is arrested pretty quickly because of an overriding fact about all fiction. We are not, after all, dealing with persons, but with textually constructed characters about which we can know no more than the words on the page give us. Derrida makes this point forcefully in his discussion of Baudelaire's little prose piece, La Fausse Monnaie. This is Derrida. As these fictional characters have no consistency, no depth beyond their literary phenomenon, the absolute inviolability of the secret they carry depends, first of all, on the essential superficiality of their phenomenality. The text says what it says, and if there is a mystery in the text which the text doesn't resolve, no amount of reader investigation is going to solve it. Counterfocalization relies on the assumption that fictional characters have the properties of real persons, and it must therefore finally fail, or become merely groundless speculation. Jeanette puts the point clearly. Systematically adopting the point of view of one of the protagonists permits an author to leave the feelings of the other one almost completely in shadow, and thus to construct for that other, at little cost, a mysterious and ambiguous personality. We do not know any more than Swann or Marcel knows about the inner truth of an Odette, a Gilberte, an Albertine. Proust would be a very good test case of this notion. What, after all, do we really mean when we ask, what's the reason for Lucy's silence? We clearly don't mean what is going on in the mind of the person Lucy. A common response, particularly perhaps among those outside of English departments, would be, well, what do the words of the text allow us to infer about Coetzee's intentions in creating this character? Why did he make Lucy say the things she says and behave in the way that she does? Which is a response that Coetzee himself and most literary theorists would regard as a little muddled. But a more sophisticated version of this response might come from someone familiar with the manuscripts lodged in the Harry Ransom Center in Austin, Texas, where Coetzee's archive is now situated. Such a student of the manuscripts could point out that what looks like an impasse reached by Coetzee in his writing of the novel when he attempted to give a fuller account of Lucy's inner life, would, they would say, show that interpretations laying great weight on her silence are barking up the wrong tree. Coetzee simply didn't know how to fill out that part of the novel, so he left it blank. Well, this isn't the place to mount an argument against such claims, but suffice it to say that my interest is in the published novel, not the creative process that went into its making, a process that in any case necessarily took place in the author's mind, and might well have included the realization that never was written down that Lucy's silence could be a powerful element in the final work. A better way of capturing the natural tendency to think in terms of intention would be to phrase the question as, what do the words of the text allow us to infer about the implied author's intentions regarding this character's motivation? The implied author being the animating scriptorial presence constructed by the reader from the evidence of the text, the one, for instance, whose critical stance towards Lurie is felt in the first sentence. But we need to specify on what basis we construct such a figure. And then our question boils down to, given our familiarity with the norms and codes of literary fiction, and given our understanding of real persons, what do the words of the text allow us to legitimately infer as the motivation of this character? And if that's what we're really asking when we ask, why is Lucy silent, we can proceed to marshal and weigh the evidence, which would include all Lucy's speeches, since we generally accept without question the convention that direct speech is accurately reported by an external narrator. It's just one of those things that we tend to accept, like flashbacks in film, unless something signals that this is an erroneous flashback or that the narrator is misrepresenting the words of the people he's writing about. We just take them as gospel. Whatever the text doesn't tell us, such as Lucy's reasons for her silence about the rape she has endured, can never be told. And what's more, Leary's inability to understand his daughter's motivations, like Marcel's inability to penetrate Albertine's intentions and feelings, is an important element in the way the novel works. It's not something we have to overcome in order to appreciate what's happening in the novel. In fictions where irony is clearly at work, it's true, where it's at work more fully than in Disgrace, I would say, our intuitions about other characters may turn out to be vindicated. And this is, of course, what happens in Emma. By the end of the novel, our sense that the things that Emma was missing she should have taken account of them, our sense is vindicated by the end of the novel. Disgrace, however, offers no such final resolution. The second part I've called modernist character. Simon Dearing's response to Spivak situates Coetzee's fiction in the context of modernist treatments of character. What probably first comes to mind when we think of modernism's challenge to earlier character conventions is its greatly expanded portrayal of interiority. Virginia Woolf's project of capturing, quote, the incessant shower of innumerable atoms that are the mind's impressions, D.H. Lawrence's rejection of what he called the old stable ego of character, are just two of the best-known articulations of this modernist impulse. We see it manifested in the fiction of James Conrad, Proust, Faulkner, Dorothy Richardson, Thomas Mann, and many others. In Ulysses, Joyce developed a technique for representing his characters' thought processes that conveyed the richness of their inner lives with unprecedented minuteness. These writers were prolonging the 19th century endeavour to convey to the reader the rich, multifaceted inner lives of their central characters, with revealing personal histories and fully particularized desires, fears, and attachments, a tradition, of course, inherited from, let's say, Samuel Richardson and sustained by Austen, the Brontes, Gaskell, Trollope, George Eliot, Meredith, Hardy, and many, many others. And other national traditions would furnish similar instances, Rousseau's La Nouvelle Héloïse being perhaps the most influential in the European context. And an important aspect of this tradition was the detailing of the complex and shifting interplay between individual and community. But European modernism was not a unified formation, as Düring observes, and the major exception he singles out is, yes, Franz Kafka, noting that, I quote, Kafka's work shares little except a generation with Catherine Mansfield's or Virginia Woolf's. Düring refers to the concept of le neutre, the neuter or neutrals, not a translatable word really, in Barthes and Blanchot, and to Barthes' degree zero writing in arguing that Kafka was the inventor of a type of literary work that, I quote, makes no claim to aesthetic expressivity, trusting that if it is sufficiently neutral, sufficiently outside the apparatuses of subjectivity, sufficiently immanent, it will, in unpredictable and uninterpretable ways, nonetheless reveal the world outside itself. And Düring says that a key element in this new form, quoting again, was to focalize a third-person, matter-of-fact narration through a passive central character who, living aslant degradation, had few or no beliefs, little or no affective disposition, little or no substance or personality at all, who was subjectively empty. Now, I think we can agree that Kafka breaks with the project of an ever-increasing complexity, subtlety, and depth in representations of character. Kay in The Castle, Joseph Kay in The Trial, Gregor Samsa in The Metamorphosis are not explorations of the subtleties of human growth and human relationship. We're not provided with past histories that illuminate present proclivities and decisions, and although we're made privy to extended mental deliberations and rafts of anxiety, we're not given access to a rich and complex interiority of the sort we've learned to expect from the novel. Even Carl Rossman in America, or The Man Who Disappeared, although a more conventional novelistic character than these, is thinly realized. To take just one account among many of Kafka's characters, Mark Anderson, commenting on what he calls the curious flattening of character in Kafka that registers his distance from 19th century psychological realism, describes what all readers must observe. Kafka's characters emerge in vivid, sharp details, often present like photographic likenesses as they execute some characteristic gesture, but they exist only as partial, flat surfaces without the depth of a past history or nuanced individual psychology. Kafka's characters are temporally flat, cut out of a historical continuum and presented to us as isolated, tantalizingly vivid, but finally opaque objects of interpretation. And I think that would be widely supported by other critics and readers of Kafka. And what Kafka's new form shows is that readers don't need characters with minutely realized subjective lives to find novels compelling. In Kafka's fiction, what we find gripping is the narration of unintelligible forces operating to terrible effect on these characters, even though, or perhaps because, their responses to the powers they encounter are often not what we would have expected, which is to say that they don't conform to the norms of character behavior established within the long tradition of realist writing. During's contention is that by reducing characterization in this way, Kafka opens his fiction to the world, quote, in unpredictable and uninterpretable ways. I think what he means is that once the representational conventions governing the individual and the community in the 19th century novel are suspended, the fictional character is freed from the inherited network of norms and expectations that previously circumscribed his or her behavior. We can no longer predict how he's going to react to the events in his world, and he behaves with a waywardness and inscrutability that may be closer to the behavior of persons we encounter in the real world than the ordered, comprehensible trajectories of the more traditional hero. The picture is complicated by the role that fictional characters have in moulding our perception of real persons, just to revert to John Fro's argument for a moment. If all novels were like Kafka's, we might see one another in a rather different light. I shudder to think what it would be like. Of course, the world Kafka's characters have to deal with is equally unpredictable and inscrutable, as if our inability to understand the actions of individuals is writ large in our puzzled apprehension of what is no longer a community, but an aggregate of obscurely perceived beings. We can also approach this question from the perspective of the writer, something implied in Düring's notion of trust. By stripping your characters of the conventional fullness of interior life, he implies, you'll find your writing taking you into unexpected places, since they're no longer subject to the requirements of psychological verisimilitude. And there's maybe an echo here of Bakhtin's account of the independence of Dostoevsky's characters from the authorial presence. Many writers, Coetzee included, have spoken of the process of creation as a journey whose destination is not revealed until it's reached. Shedding the trappings of richly detailed interiority may be one way that route can be opened and inventiveness fostered. It's perhaps tempting to say that fiction, including drama, has always dealt in both round and flat characters, to use Ian Forster's well-known terminology, and that what Kafka did was to create major characters with the features that had belonged exclusively to minor characters, to those flat characters who seem to have no depth to their psychological existence. But as Alex Woloff has shown in his study of the relation between protagonists and minor characters in 19th century fiction, minor characters tend to be instances either of a single functional role, the worker, the servant, the aristocrat, or of the eccentric. And Dickens is full of these two kinds of minor character, and he cites, as an example, two contrasting minor characters from Jane Eyre. Servant Grace Poole, it's just a servant, and the eccentric Bertha Mason. But Kafka's protagonists are neither. For Lukács, as I'm sure you'll remember, Kafka's work is, quote, the very type of modernist art, but not, of course, in a good way. It might seem odd that Lukács should place Kafka at the center of his assault on modernist subjectivism, in contrast to what he saw as the objective truths of Thomas Mann's fictions, whose characters he argued could be read as types revelatory of the social realities of his time, when it's precisely Kafka's emptying out of subjectivity that contrasts strikingly with the rich inner lives described by authors such as Mann. For many readers, Kafka's characters have meaning because they do function as types, instantiating in vivid form the wrestle with faceless and all-powerful bureaucracies, among other things. But for Lukács, the painful trajectories of Kafka's protagonists constituted a shrill cry of angst by their author, had distorted an entirely personal view of objective reality. For similar reasons, Lukács had little time for Beckett, and when we consider Kafka's successors, especially if the terminus of our investigation is the work of Coetzee, it's inevitable that we should ask where Beckett stands. The differences are immense, of course. Unlike Kafka, Beckett is much concerned with interiority, to the extent that Malone Dies and The Unnameable present us with hundreds of pages of a character's inner life and only a dim sense of the outer world he or it inhabits. But one could say that in these works, Beckett has transferred the tortuous passage through the external world undertaken by Kafka's characters to an equally tortuous traversal of the internal world, mental encounters replacing physical encounters. But the sense of a wayward, unexplained, unpredictable journey towards an unknown endpoint remains. In Murphy and Malloy, of course, the earlier novels, the wanderings are physical as well as mental, and the similarities with Kafka's fiction are more obvious. And of course, these are the things that Lukács couldn't stand, this failure to abide by what he understood as the psychological reality of the world in its communally constituted existence. Right, third and final part, Coetzee and the Kafkan character. Let me turn now to Düring's disagreement with Spivak. Her reading of Disgrace is, these particular comments about Lucy and counterfocalization, her reading of Disgrace is, he declares, insensitive to the novel's modernism. This is because Coetzee, and Düring says many others, though he doesn't name them, have continued to deploy the modernism not of Woolf and Joyce and Mann, but of Kafka. Both Lurie and his daughter exemplify what he calls the Kafka lineage modernist character. Spivak's project of counterfocalizing from Lucy's perspective, therefore, is doomed. There is nothing in her, says Düring, to focalize through. Düring adds an important qualification. Lucy and David are simultaneously thematizations of the Kafka lineage character. In adding this qualification, he's implicitly agreeing with Spivak that intertextuality plays a part in our reading of these characters. We register them, that is, as versions of Kafka's characters, and thus as literary artifacts as well as representations of persons, which perhaps makes them more different from Kafka's own characters than Düring allows. I'll come back to the idea of thematization. Kafka and Beckett are writers who have most influenced Coetzee. This much is widely accepted, and he has acknowledged this himself in many places. And to say this is already to place Coetzee outside the tradition championed by Lukács and represented most fully and brilliantly in South African writing by Nadine Gordimer, whose espousal of Lukács' version of novelistic excellence is well known. Coetzee's interest in Kafka has been evident for a long time, from the superb essay on the Burrow to the long New York Review of Books discussion of a new translation of The Castle, to the invocation of the story Report to an Academy in The Lives of Animals, and the overtly Kafkaesque setting of the story At the Gate in Elizabeth Costello. Critics have often noted the presence of In the Penal Colony behind an episode in Waiting for the Barbarians, a hunger artist behind elements of Michael Kay, and Before the Law behind At the Gate. Then there's the unmistakable allusion in the naming of the protagonist of Coetzee's fourth novel, notwithstanding Coetzee's own demurral. There is no monopoly on the letter K, he said, and Gordimer's disclaimer, the initial probably stands for Kotze or Kukumor and has no reference, nor did it have, to Kafka. Despite these, I don't think you can call a character Michael K and not have your readers think of The Trial and the Castle. If Coetzee had wanted simply to create a bit of mystery or reader character distance by withholding his protagonist's full last name, there were 25 other letters he could have chosen. To read K as an allusion to Kafka is, of course, already to institute a difference. Kafka's use of the letter is not elusive in the same way. Once again, therefore, thematization is at work. And this alphabetic substitution is a clear example of Froese, quote, thinking of characters as pieces of writing, since there's no evidence that in the imagined world the protagonist is called merely K. Nobody refers to him as K. This is our implied author, if you like, who's doing this. How accurate is it then to see Coetzee's characters as functioning in the same way as Kafka's? And what might this tell us about the way we read characters in fiction, and particularly modernist fiction? In terms of narrative technique, only one of Coetzee's novels uses Kafka's preferred mode, past tense external narration, focalized through the main character, for most of its length, the very novel in which Kafka is alluded to in the title. Although there are some similarities between K as a character and the protagonist of The Trial in the Castle, their painful trajectories in a hostile environment, where their efforts to improve their situations lead them only further into trouble, their straightforward beliefs and sets of goals, their innocence of the world they find themselves in compared to the apparently much more knowing individuals they meet, there are also significant differences. Coetzee makes relatively sparing use of free and direct discourse, so that Michael K's mental world is kept at a slight distance from the reader, whereas we're granted direct access to the thought processes of K and Joseph K. And this gives Coetzee's narrator a stronger presence, which perhaps starts with the oddly generic and ironic title of the book, Life and Times of Michael K. It's an oddly self-ironizing title. Certainly, if you just read that title, you would have no sense of what the novel was like. Michael K. may not have the rich interiority of a Dorothea Brooke or an Isabel Archer, but he has a more substantial presence as a member of society, even on its margins, than Kafka's protagonists, and he has a more colourful personality than they do, with such characteristics as the shyness brought on by his hair lip, his dedication to his mother, his love of gardening. No real evidence here, I would say, for During's contention that Coetzee's fiction operates outside the apparatuses of subjectivity. First-person narration, or more strictly in narratological terms, character-bound narration, whether in the present tense or the past tense, necessarily reveals the workings of the central character's inner life, and when Coetzee uses this technique, it's revelatory of a consciousness with a complex history, unlike the present-focused consciousnesses in Kafka. We're made privy to the long history of the built-up anger and mortification experienced by Magda in the Heart of the Country, or the magistrate's acknowledgement of the long-standing compromises that have made his position possible in Waiting for the Barbarians, or in Foe Susan Barton's determination to record her past, or in Age of Iron Mrs. Curran's uneasy examinations of her former life. Eugene Dorn and Jacobus Coetzee in Dusklands are less fully realized characters, and the reader is very aware of their textual construction. Coetzee's allegiance to modernism is clearer in this early work, but even in these early works we're far away from Kafka's neutral narrative voice. The language is often highly charged, strongly metaphorical, and vividly descriptive. From the Master of Petersburg on, Coetzee's favored narrative technique has been present tense external narration, focalized through the central character. Dostoevsky in that novel, David Leary in Disgrace, Elizabeth Costello in the larger part of that novel, if it is a novel, named after her, Paul Raymond in Slow Man, and Simon in The Childhood of Jesus. I'll come back to these last two novels. Boyhood and Youth could be added to the list, although they raise rather different questions about characterization, being memoirs or semi-memoirs, as do the formerly diverse works Summertime and Diary of a Bad Year. Thanks to what Spivak somewhat pejoratively calls the relentless vocalization of these works, I don't mean pejorative towards Coetzee, but towards the character being represented, the reader is put in an extremely intimate relation with the character, quite as much as in the case of the first-person fictions with character-bound narration. And although Coetzee's language is always precisely honed, it's not colourless. At the same time, there are numerous characters in the novels who remain unfathomable, their motivations and passions inaccessible to the focalizer and thus to the narrator and reader. They include Henrik and Anna, the barbarian girl, Friday, Verkeil, Nechayev, and Petrus in the various novels in which they appear. I'm not sure we're even tempted to counterfocalize these characters. So forbiddingly unreachable do their inner lives seem, even though the protagonists put in a great deal of effort in trying to read them. Yet they don't function as minor characters in the traditional way. They are neither of the types identified by Wallach in the 19th century novel, the functional type or the eccentric. And they have a strong presence in the affective space of the novel, even when they don't occupy much of what Wallach calls its character system. Kafka has many mysterious personages who come and go, but none who operates in quite this way. And we perhaps have to go back to Melville and figures like Queequeg and Bartleby for predecessors. What then of Düring's argument that both Lurie and his daughter are Kafka lineage modernist characters? Let me remind you of his description of this type of character, one who, living aslant degradation, had few or no beliefs, little or no affective disposition, little or no substance or personality at all, who was subjectively empty. It's very hard to match up this description with the figure of David Lurie, who has strong, if obsolete, beliefs, powerful feelings, and a distinctive personality. Of course, as both Froh and Derrida would insist, we know no more about him than the text tells us, and we shouldn't make the mistake, as Froh says Wallach does, of imagining, quote, the quasi-persons of narrative to be somehow extricable from the texts in which they fully exist. But this is true of all fictional characters, not a peculiarity of the Lurie character. Düring, referring to the scene in which Lurie appears before a disciplinary board at his university, claims that, quote, Lurie's refusal to confess bears witness to his sense of himself as living outside the regimes of normative subjectivity. End of quote. I would say rather that it bears witness to his rejection of the institution's attempt to police the most intimate areas of its members' lives, a rejection which the novel, to some extent at least, implicitly endorses. Rather than living outside the regimes of normative subjectivity, Lurie is asserting his rights as a private individual out of a firm sense of his own subjecthood. There's a parallel of sorts with Kay's appearance before the court in the trial. He too speaks out against his unjust treatment, but where Kay rambles on at length with no clear sense of where his discourse is going, Lurie's responses are controlled and to the point, if not entirely appropriate in the context. If Lurie isn't subjectively empty, as Düring would claim, what about Lucy? The claim is not, of course, about the real woman we might imagine on the basis of the few portions of the text devoted to her. It would be perfectly possible, someone may even be doing it as I speak, to write a novel along the same lines as The House on Eccles Street, tracing Lucy's upbringing by a soon-to-be divorced young couple, her joining of a commune, coming out as a lesbian, establishing a small farm business with her partner Helen, then Helen's departure, negotiations with Petrus about the land, the arrival of her disgraced father, the rape, the decision to keep the baby, and to accept the status of Petrus's wife. In the right hands, it could be an excellent novel. But it would be, like The House on Eccles Street, an exercise of the imagination, not strictly a reading of Coetzee's text. For Lucy, the character in disgrace, is defined by her silence, by her refusal to articulate her experience and her thought processes, at least to her father. And since we only know and see what her father knows and sees, she remains closed to us. It's not a matter of being sensitive to clues that enable us to understand Lucy in a way her father doesn't, but the implied author does, as is the case with Emma. We may not want to share David's frustration, but it's all that the novel offers us. Lucy doesn't present the same challenge to intelligibility as Friday or the Barbarian Girl or Verkuil, but she shares with them an inscrutability and unpredictability that does indeed count among Coetzee's contributions to late modernism. If Melanie, Petrus, and the others don't represent quite the same powerful negativity, it's partly because Lurie makes little attempt to fathom their interior existences, much as we might wish him to. We register this as a moral failing, but not as an invitation to counterfocalize. So, I find myself in partial agreement with Düring. Coetzee's inheritance from a certain strand of modernism, Kafka and Beckett, not Joyce and Woolf, includes the willingness to exploit the capacity of literature to at once create and withhold characters, and to make that withholding a crucial and powerful element in the unfolding narrative. And I'm in partial agreement with Spivak, but I'd want to complement her account by stressing, as much as the urge to counterfocalize, the importance of the novel's resistance to that urge. It makes us want to do it, but it also refuses to allow us to do it. A truly ethical response to the other, if I can put it in Levinasian terms, involves accepting the limits to what one can know and respecting the alterity that remains beyond one's grasp. This, perhaps, is something Lurie has learned by the end of the novel. In resisting the reader's will to counterfocalize, Coetzee's fiction challenges the drive to obtain ever fuller knowledge of the mind and feelings of the other that has animated so much of the novel tradition, and so much of a certain strand of ethics too. In this response, he is a true heir of Kafka. However, as I've suggested, the thematization of the workings of character and counterfocalization that we find in Coetzee marks a difference from Kafka, though not, I would say, from Beckett. The very issue I've been discussing is strikingly brought to our attention by one of Lucy's reproaches to her father. She says, "You behave as if everything I do is part of the story of your life. You are the main character, I am a minor character who doesn't make an appearance until halfway through. Well, contrary to what you think, people are not divided into major and minor. I am not minor. I have a life of my own, just as important to me as yours is to you, and in my life, I am the one who makes the decisions." So, we have a very clear example of thematization of the very process of character and of focalization and counterfocalization. And this thematization of the processes of character in fiction is a feature of Coetzee's writing that's taken to an extreme in another novel, in Slow Man. In this novel, we're comfortably at home in the mental world of a character-bound narrator, whom we're happy to treat as a person-like entity, when, with the eruption into the fictional world of the author of our focalizer, that's to say, when Paul Raymond finds Elizabeth Costello knocking at his door, we're forced to start treating him as a piece of writing. There's a shift that we go through in the middle of the novel. I don't think it quite works. The power of focalization produces at least a partial willingness to continue treating Paul Raymond as a real person, even though we're being now invited to think of him as a fictional character being created by the author who's also present. But it's Elizabeth Costello whose reality remains somewhat shadowy and resistant to counterfocalization. I come finally to the childhood of Jesus. It's written once more in Coetzee's favourite mode, present tense, external narration, focalized through a single character. We follow that character, Simon, through a series of events and interactions, actions and reactions. Of all the individuals Simon tries to understand, the most resistant to his probing, and hence resistant to our attempts to counterfocalize, is the boy David. But compared with the earlier focalizers, there's an absence in Simon's mental world. We get none of the hints of a reconstructible past that we've been given in earlier novels. Dostoevsky's marriage and gambling habits, Costello's experience as a young woman in Australia, Raymond's immigration from France, and so on. Instead, the absence of past memories is made a significant part of the story. It's thematized, if you like. Simon, like all who come to the city of Novilla, has been washed clean of his past. Like Kafka's protagonists, he simply appears on the scene. Someone must have slandered Joseph K. It was late evening when K arrived. The man at the gate, one morning when Gregor Samsa awoke from troubled dreams, and now the man at the gate points them towards a low, sprawling building in the middle distance. It's as if Coetzee is thematizing not just the debt to Kafka, but the Kafka lineage character itself. Novilla is like the space of a Kafka novel, filled with characters who have no pasts. We might note two more things about the novel. Coetzee is more scrupulous in his use of focalization, whereas Kafka hovers between external and internal viewpoints. For instance, he allows himself the freedom to provide the reader at the outset with the name of his focalizing character, where Coetzee uses he, or since he's with his young companion, they, them, and we don't learn the name until much later. And in any case, the name itself, Simon, is something he's been given as part of his new identity. Even names in this society are less secure than they are in our own world. And the second thing we might note about the opening sentence is the nod to Kafka. The man at the gate sends us back to Elizabeth Costello's appearance at the gate, in the piece of that name, which happens in an avowedly Kafkaesque setting, and from there to the man at the gate in Before the Law. Once again, we have an inheritance from Kafka thematized as such, outside the consciousness we're being introduced to. No sense that Simon is thinking of Kafka. I've resisted the idea that the narrative style of Coetzee's fiction is matter-of-fact and neutral, as Düring terms it. It's rhetorically spare, but it's capable of remarkable intensity and richness of resonance. However, The Childhood of Jesus comes much closer to the neutrality prized by Barthes and Blanchot. Barthes calls degree zero writing, quote, a style of absence which is almost an ideal absence of style, a writing that deliberately forgoes any elegance or ornament. He cites Camus' The Outsider as its first practitioner, a novel, incidentally, that one would have to count as an important example of the Kafka lineage in modernism. Let me read just one short paragraph of The Childhood of Jesus as a reminder of its characteristic style. It comes from very early in the novel. At the far end of the corridor, he locates a shower cubicle. There is no soap. He undresses the child, undresses himself. Together they stand under a thin stream of tepid water while he does his best to wash them. Then, while the child waits, he holds their underwear under the same stream, which soon turns cool and then cold, and wrings it out. Defiantly naked, with the child beside him, he pads down the bare corridor back to their room and bolts the door. With their one and only towel, he dries the boy. Now get into bed, he says. The only place, I think, where the style may be thought to assert itself is in Defiantly Naked. Otherwise, the writing is as thin and tepid as the water of the shower. Lacking a past, his experiences and thoughts narrated in flat workaday language, Simon as a character has none of the complex interiority of a David Lurie or a Paul Raymond. His stay in Novilla has been forced upon him and consists largely of a series of further demands made upon him, many of which he finds baffling. His one active enterprise, apart from simply learning to live in this new environment, is finding David's mother. But even this seems to be a compulsion rather than a free choice. Here, then, is a work that does bear out Düring's claim that Coetzee follows Kafka in focalizing a third-person, matter-of-fact, passive central character. Düring has argued in an unpublished essay, kind of expansion of the piece in the PMLA forum, that Coetzee attempted and failed to achieve something like Kafka's neutrality, and that this failure was due to, I quote, the brutal structures of South African colonialism as they bore down upon an Anglophone writer of rural Afrikaner descent, end of quote. And this meant, Düring argues, that no matter how hard Coetzee tried to resist the demands on him to write politically engaged fiction, the pressure of his immediate context made itself felt. Although apartheid was officially a thing of the past in 1999, I would say Disgrace is still a novel obsessed with the power relations between the races and the sexes. Perhaps The Childhood of Jesus is Coetzee's first truly post-South African novel, in which, having escaped the tensions and torsions of South African life, he's at last able to achieve a neutrality of style and characterization that equals Kafka's, and like Kafka, can follow his characters wherever they take him, however strange the byways they may lead him along, trusting, as Düring puts it, that they will nonetheless reveal the world outside the novel. Thank you. And I'm very happy to take questions. Please.
You've probably read this Spivak piece about the childhood of Jesus in public books, where she refers to what Coetzee is doing as writing creative theory, right?
No, I haven't seen that.
Oh, it's a short kind of clever piece,
yeah.
but I'm persuaded by this notion that much of what he's doing in his novels, right, is really theorizing, right, or inviting us to theorize.
Yeah.
And so if one takes that kind of analysis, there's a way in which character comes to be subordinated to the thought experiment that goes into theory, right? And kind of thinking along those lines, there's a way in which we could also read the childhood of Jesus as perhaps, right, a most perfect merging, right, of theory and fiction, right? They're still kind of held apart in Elizabeth Costello. So I don't know if you would want to weigh in on this kind of idea of writing theory by way of fiction, and if that, how that would intersect with your theories of character, right? Because if character is subordinated to the, theoretical experiment, then that would explain why we get these thin, depleted.
And it would render unnecessary any reference to Kafka, presumably, because it would justify the way the novel is. Possibly. I mean, I agree that it's a novel that wears its theory, on its sleeve, as it were, rather than obscuring it. And can you hear me, by the way, without the mic? Are you saying no? Okay. If you recall, in Elizabeth Costello, there's one of the moments when the text stops being fiction and begins to get a bit theoretical about itself, about the novel of ideas, and how the novel of ideas requires characters to be real novels and not just ideas which are strung on a series of cardboard figures. And the danger, of course, of reading Childhood of Jesus in that way is not to read it as a novel, but to read it as though it were simply a framework for a discussion of ideas. And I think that would, I have to read the Spivak piece, obviously, but I think to take it entirely in that direction would be to fail to do justice to the degree to which it does work as a novel, and particularly in the representation of a child whose take on the world and on things like language and communal behavior are inscrutable, are a challenge to our norms of thinking. And those aren't, I wouldn't say those are presented in a theoretical or philosophical way. Those are presented as challenges to philosophy or theory. Looking not at the boy, but at the society in which these two have found themselves, I don't know how many of you know the novel, but it's a strange kind of socialism. Everybody is very nice to everybody else, but there's very little sexual energy. There's very little crime. There's one incident of crime that occurs, and it's clearly a huge exception. And there again, and the main character Simone keeps having little attempts to make jokes or be ironic, and then nobody gets them because irony doesn't exist in this culture, and so on. And it seems to me that one of the things Coetzee is doing is creating a rationally based culture. What would it be if one constructed one society rationally? And then what would the limitations be? And he shows the limitations very clearly. So I don't see it as a book of theory. I see it as a book which raises a host of philosophical questions, but insists that both as a literary work itself, but as a work that deals with imagined persons, that the theoretical answers will never be enough. And I don't know if Spivak takes that into account. I'll have to see. Thanks for the question. Mary.
Just to follow on from that, it seems to me that what you sort of reminded me of in the art of Coetzee's work is the privative aspect, the sort of series of privations, intense privations, and that perhaps includes privations of a consolation to us, oh, this is a novel, we recognize a character, we could understand Lucy, etc., etc. But those sorts of, and they're not just easy constellations, they're consistently rude. But then I think things like Slow Man, and then particularly Childhood of Jesus, ask, in the face of that very painful deprivation, well, what possible goods or constellations remain? I mean, I think that the Childhood of Jesus, it poses itself as a sort of afterwards, adopting his own
Yeah. Yeah.
a refugee, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
And then say, well, what could be left?
What's left?
Other
Yeah.
than taking the dog to the euthanasia, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
And I think that seems to be the question. I'm not sure that's a question answered by character. It seems to me that the attitude to character you described is very much in that larger framework,
Hmm.
if you see what I mean. I
So.
don't think that's, in other words, I don't think it's a question of tokenization or non-tokenization, or neutrality,
Hmm.
but something about the way in which, for us, the idea of character is rather concerning, and if we tend to worry about what
Yeah.
is that,
Yeah. Yeah.
you called it Levinas question,
Yeah.
and in some sense it is an ethical question, but it's also a question of how the novel could survive in
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
zone.
Yeah. I don't know if you all heard Mary's question, but if I can summarize it brutally, given all the privations and deprivations in Coetzee's fiction, everything is taken away that might console us. What consolation does it leave us with, and in particular, what life does the novel have left if so much is taken away, right? And I do think that the childhood of Jesus marks an even more extreme step in this process of taking away what would normally console us. But as always, I think it is those moments, or represented moments we're invited to share with the fictions, at which the virtually ineffable, inexpressible, what he calls the idea of justice in one of his conversations, seems to operate irrespective of reward or any of the more conventional ways of consoling oneself or being consoled, so that when the Child of Jesus ends, it reminds me of the end of the Waiting for the Barbarians as well, which it seems to end on a note of irresolution. We don't know where these characters are going, what's going to happen next. The very fact of this moment, and especially, I suppose, above all, the final sentence of disgrace, the very fact of something more potent than what rational discourse can achieve coming through is consolation. Maybe the wrong word, but it's a reassurance, or it's an assertion of the life of, I don't know what to call it, the ethical mind. That these imagined characters have impulses which they often don't understand. David Leary breaking down and crying when he's had to put corpses of dogs into an incinerator, but not knowing why this is such a potent experience. The strange challenge that the child offers in disgrace. I've talked about this in terms of instrumentalization. I mean, I think what Coetzee is constantly refusing is any instrumental notion of ethics or justice, that A will lead to B will lead to C. And this is why I like Düring's notion that a writer like Coetzee will, and maybe especially in The Childhood of Jesus, will allow his characters lives that take them into places that neither we, and quite probably Coetzee himself, could have foreseen, that they have a kind of freedom from the constraints of conventions of characterization, plot, genre, etc. And it's in that inscrutability, that freedom of a certain kind, that some kind of positive rests. We talk about this some more.
I get very worried when people use the word inscrutable. It sort of starts ineffable. And I think that's why I started. I sent you off on the wrong track by talking about consolation, because I certainly we are meant to be deeply unconsoled when we read this here. On the other hand, there is something about the way in which it is never
Yeah. Well, there's a, yeah.
That seems to me to be not whittled away.
Yeah, exactly. No, I absolutely agree. Yeah, yeah.
That care is
Yeah.
not the only thing that's not whittled away, but it's not articulated as a humanistic or
No, no.
value.
Well, that's what I mean by inscrutable and indeed ineffable. I don't think I've ever used the word ineffable before in my career, so I apologize for it. But yes, there's no getting behind. I mean, that is a Levinasian point. There's no getting behind the responsibility one has for the other who appears, in front of you. It's not that you can analyze it or justify it discursively or logically. It's there. It's the way you are. And similarly, Lurie and his dogs. It's just, you don't like inscrutable though. It's not. It's beyond any discourse in terms of cause and effect or rationality. Well, we can continue this conversation. Yeah.
Yeah. I have a question just about childhood, actually, for Coetzee. So in the child of Jesus, David, the boy, doesn't have. He doesn't remember all about the ship crossing, right?
Right.
And yet, memory isn't as much of a problem for him as it would be for the other characters, because there's not a sense that he needs a deep memory as a child. And so I just wonder kind of what particular problems of vocalization child characters pose for him, and then for Coetzee as a novelist, and then also what this says to us about the questions of political community that are implicitly addressed in vocalization, right? So for Bullock, it's a question of democracy. For Lukács, it's a question of totality, community, togetherness, right? So for Coetzee, one uncharitable reading of the child of Jesus would just be to say, this is yet another instantiation of the individual against the totalizing bureaucracy, right? That is in some ways what Simone, because Simone does have emotions, right? Simone does have some memories and isn't a neutral character, as many of the others are. So I was just wondering if you could kind of piece together that issue of the problem of childhood and character, and then what the issues of political community are here.
I'm trying to think of other children in Coetzee. Do you mean in Coetzee's fiction in general? Are you thinking specifically of that novel?
Well, no, nothing. I'm thinking in particular of this novel, but also just as a general issue of absence of the past, right? In Kafka, I can't think of any Kafkan children, right?
No.
But why, if of course, if this is something that eludes the entire issue of character, then I want to know why.
Yeah. I suppose you could say that in removing memories from most of its inhabitants, the citizens of the city are, as it were, born again. There is a kind of Christian reference there, and the idea of being washed clean. So everyone, in a sense, is made to live as children, as to start again with minimal memories. David, of course, is this exceptional child who doesn't have memories in the way that everybody else would have if they had them, but seems to have come into being possessed of these extraordinary abilities, like the ability to read, which most of the novel he doesn't seem to possess at all, and then suddenly it turns out that he can read perfectly well. So I'm not sure where we could go with that, because it's such an exceptional case, and I can't think of Coetzee's engagement with the idea of the child anywhere else, but someone might be able to think of something. And I'm struggling a bit to relate that then to questions of political community. You're right that Coetzee is wary of grand claims for this or that type of community, and the one in Novia, in Childhood of Jesus, is obviously a kind of dystopia based on certain theories of what constitutes the good life. It's a kind of Platonic idea, I suppose. But Coetzee seems always to be concerned with the nuts and bolts of relationships. So let's say the revolutionary figures in The Master of Petersburg are not fully drawn, but the figure of Dostoevsky, who is at once attracted and repelled by them, is. So it seems to me that Coetzee is always bringing those issues of political determination, freedom within a society, down to the particular individuals, which is why I would say that character is normally very important to him. That's where Childhood of Jesus does something interestingly different. But I don't know if you can think, if you can put forward a stronger sense within Coetzee of these larger political communal issues. Do you think they're there in a way that goes beyond thinking about how individuals, as you were saying, the individual against the bureaucracy, but in other contexts, other kinds of individual relations to the larger world? Can you think of ways in which he goes beyond that?
No, not necessarily, and this is why I was just thinking back to the, when Lukács writes against Kafka, or Lukács writes against Beckett, that Coetzee, I'm hoping that Coetzee could offer something different against that tradition, right? Or offer something different than the democratic idea of the 19th century novel in Wallach's character space and character space. Yeah. Well, I think it is different from the Wallachian character space in the 19th century novel. I think he's upsetting that mapping of character relations onto democracy. I don't think you don't see anything like that in Coetzee. But I suspect Lukács wouldn't have been a fan for the reasons that he didn't like Kafka or Beckett. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the active reader and connect it to the end of your talk. It seems to me, if you're agreeing with Turing that Childhood of Jesus achieves this opening onto the world that Coetzee wasn't able to achieve before, and if that allows characters to sort of wander in a different way, what does that mean for readers of this novel? And what I'm wondering what you think about the active reader in that context, and whether Coetzee is thinking of the active reader, or whether that form of characterization is soliciting passivity or activity. I'm just wondering about that trace in the earlier part of your talk.
Yeah. Okay. So the question is, what about the active versus passive reader in the Childhood of Jesus, where something very different seems to be going on? And it's true, I didn't tie those two things together. Well, I suppose what I've tried to show all the way through the talk is that there's no simple point on that spectrum where you could say, oh, this is the ideal way of reading Coetzee novel, or any novel for that matter, that it's open to discussion, and the discussion will never end about how far we can counterfocalize, how far we can imaginatively reconstruct that which the text doesn't give us, or how strong the text signals are. Spivak's argument is that in Disgrace the signals are very, very strong. We can build this counter-image of the world in which these characters live from Lucy's perspective. And I'm a bit skeptical about that. In the Childhood of Jesus, clearly we have this child in the middle of the novel who is even more, may I use the word, inscrutable than Lucy. He's positively, unreachable as a mental entity. We cannot for a moment know what's going on inside his head some of the time. And so the reader is simultaneously, as I was saying in the case of Lucy and these other characters in the earlier novels, simultaneously provoked, to use Spivak's word, provoked into trying to counterfocalize and having that resistance the novel refuses. So is that active? Yes, I suppose it is. It invites us to be active, but then it rejects our activity, or it sidelines it, or it challenges it. Which is, why I think reading a Coetzee novel is probably requires more active contribution than reading most novels. And at the same time, it's more baffling or more resistant to our interpretive effects. Now, does that tie in with Düring's notion that these characters, because they don't have full interior lives, can wander more freely through their existence? Does that relate to the reader's activity? Well, yes, because that's what makes them, because they don't behave like 19th century characters, it is more necessary. We don't just get swept along by their actions. We never know quite what David, or certainly not what Lucy is going to do next. So yeah, I've just come around to saying yes, Coetzee's novels, including Childhood of Jesus, require an active reader, but an active reader who then has to struggle with what the response to that activity is. It's not always simply that it yields the thing we're looking for. Does that make sense?
An active but not a motivated reader.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. And I'm still trying to work through this claim by Düring that, I've been going along with it. Once Coetzee is freed from the pressure to write novels that are politically engaged in some sense, they're never simply politically engaged, but the earlier novels certainly take on specific political themes. So is Düring right to say that that's what prevented him from doing what he really wanted to do, just to write like Kafka, and that finally in Childhood of Jesus, he is freed from those pressures, and now he can write more like Kafka? I'm not entirely convinced by the argument about pressure forcing him to write in a certain way that by implication he didn't really want to do. I think he wrote what he wanted to write, and he engaged to the degree that he wanted to engage with the South African world he was living in, and the greater world beyond that. But I do think The Childhood of Jesus marks a difference, and that maybe living in Australia in a more relaxed setting has something to do with it.
It's time to move ourselves upstairs and continue the Q&A over a reception in the English department lounge. So 258 Goldwin Smith. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.